On a cold morning in the quiet town of Machias, Maine, Police Chief Keith Mercier receives a 911 call.
911, what's your emergency?
It's the Smiths, owners of a local farm close to the police station. They're calling to complain about their new neighbors. According to the Smiths, strange things were constantly happening around the neighboring barn. Every night, an unusual number of vans would pull up to the barn and leave just minutes later. And a strange, powerful smell was emitting from the barn almost 24/7. When they asked their neighbors too many questions, the neighbors stopped responding altogether. So after getting everything together for the police report, he was puzzled by their story. Police Chief Mercier opened an investigation into the activity on the farm. And in just the few weeks the police monitor the Smiths' new neighbors, they gather probable cause to request a search warrant from a judge. So he takes a few officers from the department to go into the property with him to conduct a thorough search. And Police Chief Mercier discovers the unthinkable. He uncovers an illegal growing farm and over $1 million of marijuana and illegal drugs. The barn was fully furnished with a functioning drug farm that had everything they needed to operate on its own. They had an entire irrigation, lighting, and humidifying system with over 2,600 different marijuana plants growing. Chief Mercier knew he had just uncovered one of the biggest illegal drug operations of his entire career and officially began to seize all of the illegal drugs. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't just a small-time drug bust, but in fact, this was connected to a large triad criminal enterprise that not only was operating inside of Maine, but actually encompassed the entire United States. Let's say you're someone like Wang Kokkai, the leader of the 14K Triad, the largest and most dangerous Asian criminal organization on the planet, and you needed a way to raise money internationally. So being an organized crime leader, you thought to yourself, why not rely on good old-fashioned drugs? But not things like hard drugs, something with more of a gray area, like marijuana. Many states around the country were making it legal, so demand for it was skyrocketing and you'd be the one to make millions from it under the radar. But marijuana is not exactly an easy crop to grow undetected. You need space, and lots of it, and properties where no one could come sniffing around at the first sign something unusual was happening. So you grabbed a map of the good old USA and started looking for the perfect location, and that's when you found the ideal spot. Maine, a state known for its small size, rural farmland, and seaside coast was a perfect place for you to set up shop. You had everything you'd need to grow marijuana and make millions of dollars. Farmland, easy transportation, and not many people to ask you questions. You knew this place was a gold mine for you and your plants, and you weren't alone. Over the past year in Maine, authorities knew of over 270 alleged operations and 100 confirmed cases of illegal triad cannabis properties operating in the countryside of Maine, and were raiding a new operation almost every day. But authorities still couldn't answer just one question. What's exactly happening in Maine? So after you decided Maine was the perfect place to start your operation, you need a good property to actually grow your plants. But it wasn't actually hard to choose because Maine was full of them. Each county had the perfect property to blend in undetected. They would sit in plain sight and no one would suspect a thing. They were properties that looked like this, and this, and they were scattered across the entire state. The hotspots were in Somerset County, Franklin County, and Oxford County, just to name a few. And you'd set your sights on the perfect property to start your first illegal marijuana farm in Somerset County, Maine. Right here. There was plenty of land, it was super cheap, and you were far away from anyone else who could bother you. But there was only one problem. You weren't a US citizen, so you couldn't legally buy any property. So you needed a way to buy these properties and stay clean on paper so the police wouldn't show up to your door asking you questions. And luckily for you, you knew just the right people to help you out. Since you need to buy a property, you need to do it legally and have all your paperwork filed correctly. Luckily, you had the right people to get the job done for you. Quantic Bank, a bank that helps you and other non-US citizens purchase property in the US. They even advertise on their website that whether you're a foreign national interested in purchasing an investment property in the US but are not eligible to get a social security number, we may have a mortgage option that's right for you. But you were also clever. For one extra layer of protection, when you bought the property, you got someone else to take the fall. Because once the police eventually started investigating your operation, it would only be a matter of time before they found out the name of the person who actually bought the house, and it wouldn't be yours. In fact, if you take the address of the property you just bought and get the deeds paperwork from the county's registry office, you'll discover that's exactly what you did. When you look at the deed, this property's loan wasn't purchased and signed by you, of course, because the borrower is your fall man Juan Lin, and the lenders are your friends over at Quantic Bank. And since Quantic Bank is clean on paper and Lin didn't actually know anything about you, the cops would be left high and dry and far away from ever figuring out that you were the one making it all happen. And now you could run this same scheme again and again until you had farms all across America. But before you'd start your takeover, you'd have to address a few more challenges first. In 2020, Maine legalized the sale of recreational marijuana, creating the perfect avenue for you to sneak in unnoticed. For you, this was a golden opportunity. Maine's new legislation meant that marijuana was legal, but you knew that Maine's local enforcement agencies were small, underfunded, and overwhelmed. There was no way they could keep up with the growing demand in marijuana. But what you see is a chance to fulfill the demand for weed. With your new resources, it would only be a matter of time before you'd be the king of the illegal marijuana underworld. So with Maine's law enforcement tied up, now it was really time to get to business. First, the property you just bought needs to be remodeled. Marijuana cultivation demands a lot of electricity, far more than a typical household. So you needed new 300 to 400 amp service panels to bring in additional power for all your equipment in and outside of the house. New heat pumps and storage tanks to utilize all the chemicals, and a new garage to store all of your marijuana. And after only a few changes, you would transform this property from a living area to a money printing laboratory, producing millions of dollars easier than ever before. Once you set up your weed producing farms all across the state, the next big challenge is figuring out how to transport all the product. You can't just load up a truck and drive it down the highway without attracting attention. You need a system. First, you need legitimate looking vans, one that blend in and scream you're just another ordinary delivery truck with nothing to hide. And these vans are perfect for transporting your weed across the state. You created hidden compartments and even mixed the marijuana with legitimate products to ensure it's well hidden and wouldn't be found during a search. But even with the vans, you needed a team of drivers who could stay quiet and knew the stakes. These drivers had to know the backroads of Maine and not ask too many questions. And to make sure the product got to its destination without any problems, you set up relay points, safe houses across the state where the vans could stop, switch their loads to new vehicles, and keep going. That way you could avoid roadblocks, random police checks, and nosy neighbors. And with a bit of luck and a lot of planning, you could easily get around any obstacle effortlessly. But there were still a few pieces left of the puzzle. Your transportation wasn't only about avoiding authorities, it was more importantly about your customers and your profits. You needed to stay coordinated with buyers to make sure they were prepared to receive the goods as soon as they arrived. Think about it like this. The buyers weren't just local dealers. They were part of a larger network that stretched beyond Maine, with some shipments reaching as far as New York all the way to North Dakota. If you were only going to sell your product in Maine, you might only be able to get around $280 an ounce in Maine. But if you use your vans and transportation, you could visit places like North Dakota and Maryland where the prices are almost doubled. And for a few extra hours on the road, you would now just double your profits. The best part was that staying mobile helps you avoid the law. Every van, every safe house, and every driver kept your weed empire running smooth as butter. But you still had just one more problem. You also needed workers to manage the farms, harvest the crops, and actually run the farms. and you had the perfect plan to solve exactly just that. Even with your weed farms and transport systems in place, finding employees to run your farms was actually a major challenge. You couldn't just post applications on Indeed because that would lead the cops right to you. You needed workers who were discreet, loyal, and wouldn't attract attention, and you had just the solution. You tap into the influx of Chinese migrants coming across the US border. The ones who were seeking work and a chance at a better life. You deceived them and lied to them, and with your network, you could connect with those who were vulnerable and desperate, and make them an offer they simply couldn't refuse. You'd give them employment that pays better than most jobs they could find, and you would make it seem like you actually cared about them, offering them wages and a place to stay, but the conditions were absolutely terrible. They were never allowed to leave the property, forced to stay inside 24/7, and they couldn't have any windows open to get any sunlight inside the building. It was a high-stress environment and literally felt like prison. But these workers are the hidden slaves fueling your entire empire. Without them, the operation would crumble into dust. They keep the farms running smoothly and ensure that profits would keep flowing into your bank accounts. And with your farms consistently producing and your transport systems running, the money slowly started to pour in. The Triad's marijuana empire grew to an insane amount, and the profits were enormous. You were making millions, but with big profits comes big risks. The illegal marijuana market is very dangerous. Rival gangs, law enforcement, and even betrayals within your own group are constant threats. Violence is always a risk, with disputes over territory and control leading to brutal fights. And the biggest danger came from law enforcement. The more successful you became, the more attention you attracted. It was only natural. The raids happened more often, and the authorities were getting closer and closer with each day. They started figuring out the size of your operation, identifying key people, and mapping out your network. But still, despite the risk, the Triad's influence keeps growing. Your operations spread beyond Maine, reaching other states and setting up new growth sites all across the US. The Triad's network was now a vast web of illegal marijuana farms, efficient transport systems, and a reliable workforce. The authorities tried hard to catch up to you, but you were always just one step ahead. You kept changing and improving your methods. The game of cat and mouse continued, and both sides were pushing everything to their limits.